this lesson, we're talking about Henri Bergson's book, Time and Free Will, especially chapter 2. We'll look a little bit at chapter 1 as well. I actually recorded this video yesterday, and it was about an hour long, and at the end, something went wrong with the encoding process, and the file became corrupt, and I basically lost all of that, so that was extremely sad. Now I'm going to hopefully do better than that one and not forget anything, which is commonly what happens when I give the same lecture 2 days in a row. This time I'm actually recording it in small segments instead of one entire hour-long file. I'm learning and adapting. And in some sense, that's what this lesson is all about. Henri Bergson in Time and Free Will is attempting to show us a immediate data of consciousness. So that's the subtitle of the book in English, but is the actual French title. Time and Free Will was not the French title. Time and Free Will was the English title given when the translation came out, and Bergson oversaw that translation and agreed to the name and everything, but the original name is On the Immediate Data of Consciousness. And Bergson wants to show us that one of the immediate data of consciousness, something that we should take account of when we do science and metaphysics and psychology and all of these different things. And what we find as an immediate data of consciousness is this developmental, gradual learning process where moments of time interpenetrate and enrich one another rather than standing outside of each other as discrete blocks of consciousness or states or quantities. And he calls this qualitative multiplicity. So this is the big idea. We are going to sink our teeth into this module as best we can, this idea of qualitative multiplicity. And Bergson presents this idea. He gives evidence for this idea. He makes a case for this reality based on an analysis of music, of our aesthetic feelings listening to music, and our the way that our consciousness is transformed, the way we attune our consciousness, the way that the music attunes our consciousness when we listen to it. A major element of Bergson's philosophy is critique, and this is in line in some ways with Kant, although Bergson is considered a post-Kantian, which means he has a strong critique of Kant, which we saw a little bit in our chapter. But he still wants to do a similar thing that Kant did, which is to criticize, to examine the limits, basically, of certain mental faculties, certain procedures with which we think about things. So Bergson wants to show us that language, quantity, concepts, symbols, all of this tools that we use to think and understand the world and get around in the world in our practical everyday life and in order to do science, that these tools end up distorting our view of consciousness and of our experience of time in particular. And they do so in a way which makes it impossible to understand the reality of freedom. And so the English title, Time and Free Will, really pinpoints that aspect of the arguments in this book. He wants to say that if we properly understood time without reducing it to space, without reducing it to a quantity, without reducing it to a concept, it would open the door to a new interpretation of freedom, of free will. And so that's really the overarching goal of the book. We're not going to be looking very deeply into that because that comes in chapter 3. But we're going to look at the way he kind of lays the groundwork up to that point, and then in particular his critique within chapter 2. So the first thing Bergson tries to do in chapter 1 is to lay a basic framework in which he attempts to bring us to an intuition, a glimpse, a experiential grasp of what he calls intensity. He does this in order to criticize what he sees as tendencies within the scholarship in psychology and physiology of his time, particularly two different branches, you might say, two different schools. One is what we could call intellectualist. These were people who followed in the Kantian tradition. They were neo-Kantian philosophers, people like Fechner, and a bunch of other, Weber and some other people. And he isn't completely rejecting them, but he's trying to criticize the way in which they interpret what their findings are and their framework. And the other group of physiologists and psychologists that he wants to critique are those of reductive empiricism. So these are the kind of two paths. You can think of it as like the Kantian, the school of Kantian philosophy following after Kant, and the kind of Humean, David Hume, this kind of empiricist tradition that comes and really approaches psychology and physiology in this reductive way, and this evolves into things like behavioralism. So Bergson wants to find a middle path in a way between these, and he does this by, again, turning our attention to intensity and critiquing the way that intensity is understood in these other two traditions. So he wants to show us that intensity in deep aesthetic experiences and moral experiences, these deep sentiments, the feeling of intensity cannot be reduced to the quantity of an external stimuli. And this was something that was really big in his time in physiology, and it even kind of continues in today, although people like Merleau-Ponty and Gestalt psychology have continued this critique, and others beyond them, into the 21st century. So these empiricist physiologists do these experiments where they have a light source and they increase the voltage a little bit, that's 3 whatever volts, and then that increases the stimuli, and that then should correlatively increase the intensity of the experience. And what they did basically was to try to figure out what is called the minimal sensible difference. How much do we have to increase that stimuli until the patient notices that there's a difference? And then we can calculate that number, create a constant from it, and this is what Weber and Fechner do. And then we can translate basically the intensity of feeling into a quantity of stimuli. And Bergson wants to show that while there are certain applications for this kind of method, and it does have certain scientific validity, it should not be used as fundamental in understanding the reality of intensity as a lived experience. And that's really what Bergson is interested in. And then, again, showing how that whole framework distorts the rest of our understanding of psychic life and completely makes the experience of free will impossible. So in contradistinction to these views, Bergson points us to a type of intensity which doesn't have a correlate with an external quantity of change. And he points to aesthetic experiences first. In these experiences, there's a gradual evolution of our feeling. There's not just a simple arithmetic difference between one moment and another moment. We can think about a couple different aspects of aesthetic experiences here that Bergson brings up. One is the idea of charm. And we've seen this already with Jankelevich, and he picks this up from Bergson. But a charm is something which grabs our attention, right? It sucks us in. It makes us interested. It concentrates our attention, and it intensifies our engagement with the spectacle, right? And that intensifying of the engagement is not produced by an external stimuli. That's what we're trying to prove. And very closely related to the idea of charm is the idea of grace. And grace is when you see movements that flow together and where intentionality is sort of perfectly or gracefully executing these movements. It's not choppy, it's not labored, it's not moving here and then moving there and then and shifting its intentionality and reevaluating. It's moving fluidly like someone dancing. And when we see this, it draws us in, right? It has a charm to it. It grabs our attention and it intensifies our experience of the situation gradually over time by, in a way, modulating our attitude and our attunement, right? The intensity here is in the transformation of our consciousness rather than in the things in the world. And this is really obvious in listening to music. Our intensity of enjoyment and the aesthetic intensity that we feel in this experience is not reducible to how loud the music is or how fast it is or anything like that. Obviously, loudness, speed, like the speed and all of these things, they can intensify certain aspects. And when we talk about intense music, we mean like metal or really fast like violin playing or something like that. But that doesn't exhaust what we mean by an intensely beautiful or an intensely graceful or an intensely charming music, right? Our interest and our involvement and our engagement in that music is not reducible to that external stimuli. And Bergson also talks a lot here about the idea of suggestion. And suggestion is something that really can't be reduced to an external stimuli either. When we get in this, we have to get in the mood to have the music's suggestiveness come to us. The rhythm and the monotony of the melody, and I don't mean monotony in a negative way, just the repetitiveness of it, sucks us in. It lulls us. It charms us again in the other meaning of charm, which is kind of like a magical spell that it casts on us. We get sucked into the music, and that opens us up to the suggestiveness of the music, such that once we're in that state, then you have the saxophone, played by Jonathan, of course, go, and it sounds like someone crying, and all of a sudden we're crying, right? And that's because it altered our attunement, it altered our attitude, and made us in this highly suggestive state. And that state is what Bergson is most interested in this book. When we feel these deep emotions, when we're sucked into these intense feelings, they're ineffable. They're difficult to describe. Now, we do describe them, and when we describe them, those descriptions are really only meaningful to other people who have experienced those feelings, right? I can describe this sublime feeling of listening to Mozart or something like that, and that description is really only useful to someone who has had a similar experience, and it evokes and suggests that experience. But when we try to talk about these things in terms of quantities, we really enter a whole new terrain. And Bergson wants to give us an explanation of why we do that. If I say to someone, Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven is a 10 out of 10. Like, that doesn't tell them anything about the quality of that song, the experience of it, its qualitative nuances, right? What makes that song unique against any other song, and what it feels like to listen to that song. But it communicates something. I mean, it's not an empty statement. It says, wow, this person really likes this song, and it gave him a great experience. So there is something useful in this, and we can think in clinical settings and for doctors and things. You say, how much pain did this 1 to 10, how much pain, or whatever. And that does communicate something helpful. Of course, pain doesn't come in one variety that is just differences of degree. There are qualitatively different pains. There's dull pain, there's sharp pain, a myriad of different other pains. There's very, localized pains. There's more diffuse types of pain. And there's moral pain. You see somebody suffering and you feel indignation, you feel the need to right a wrong, the type of pain we feel in front of injustice and things like that. And then there's pain of, loss and sorrow, and so there's 100 different kinds of pain or more. And even two of the same type of pain will be different based on the nuances of our life. And this is the kind of thing Bergson is really trying to sink his teeth into, right? Like, when I feel, the pain of being dumped in high school is very different than the pain of losing a loved one when you're older in life or something like that. And the nuances there are always different, and they feed into that emotion, and they shape that emotion. And so Bergson is trying to push us back towards that qualitatively complex reality of emotion, which he calls qualitative multiplicity. So again, why do we convert these realities of qualitative multiplicity into numbers? Well, in order to communicate them, right? That was the first thing we said. But how did we get there? How did we start doing that? Bergson thinks that it has a physiological and, you might say, embodied phenomenological reason. We calculate how much force and how much effort we put into our motricity, our getting around in the world, our moving our bodies, right? When I lift a book, I roughly, vaguely understand I need to lift it with this much force, and I can contrast that in my imagination with how much it's going to take to lift something really heavy, like this large box or some luggage or something. And, if you go to pick up some luggage that you think is really heavy, but then it's empty, you lift it and you're like, oh my gosh, I thought that was heavy and it wasn't, right? So in those estimations, we begin to convert what is an interior feeling and an intention into something exterior. This idea of a quantity of, force, basically. And it's based on those ideas of quantity of force that we become accustomed to converting our interior quality of experience into an external quantity of force or stimuli. So again, Bergson is not saying that numbers are bad or that quantifying things is bad. He's saying that it's something that we do for practical reasons. It's something that we do in order to communicate, but that it always covers over and loses something of the quality and the complexity and the depth and the detail and the nuance of our inner experience. And that what we really must not do is base our understanding of psychology and metaphysics and ontology on this practical, approximating, quantifying activity. Okay, let's shift gears now to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, Bergson attempts to critique and to examine how our understanding of intensity and number differentiate and intertwine. And he wants to make a distinction. He wants to pull apart two realities. One he calls numerical multiplicity or discrete multiplicity, and the other qualitative or continuous multiplicity. And he wants to show us that the creation of the idea of number is something in our minds, and it comes from our imagination or intuition of space. We imagine things in space, we spatialize our world, and here he is drawing partially on Kant and post-Kantian philosophy, people like Fichte and Hegel and Schelling. And for all of them, space is not a property of reality. It's not something that exists out there. It's a function of our mind. It's the way our mind makes sense of reality. And Bergson is following along in that tradition to some degree, although we see him in this book heavily criticize Kant on this point. So he wants to distinguish himself from Kant, but without falling back into what is called dogmatism or naive empiricism, which are views in which space is a feature of the external world. No, space is a feature of our minds, but not in the way Kant said entirely. We're not going to dig too deep into that. But that's where this is coming from, and that's how he's framing it. So he wants to say, what are the essential features of space, and what are the essential features of our experience of duration, and how can we differentiate them, and how can we understand how can we understand time without reducing it to space, without conceiving of it in this homogeneous medium of space, and conceptually converting it and translating it into space. The two features of space and duration are, on the one hand, space is a multiplicity of juxtaposition. And juxtaposition means one thing juxtaposed next to another one in an empty vacuum. And here he points to the Pythagorean view of number, where you can basically imagine it in terms of pebbles in a void. So each number is like a pebble in a void, and people, I think, know about the decad, which is this pyramid of 10 dots, and they thought that that kind of encapsulated all numerical reality. So number in this sense is a collection or a sum of discrete entities separated by a void. Our experience of duration, on the other hand, is a completely different type of multiplicity. It's a multiplicity of interpenetration, and it's a multiplicity of continuity. So there's an infinity in this multiplicity, an infinity of shades and nuances and parts, infinitely dividable, but the parts interpenetrate. They form a continuum with one another, and together they form what Bergson calls an organic whole. they coexist together in a way that is utterly different from the way in which parts coexist in number and in juxtaposition. So Bergson begins the chapter by defining number. He says that number may be defined in general as a collection of units, or speaking more exactly, as the synthesis of the one and the many. Here he sounds like a pre-Socratic philosopher, not that different from Philolaus, who we saw earlier in the semester. Every number is one, since it is brought before the mind by a simple intuition and is given a name, but the unit which attaches to it is that of a sum, and it covers a multiplicity of parts which can be considered separately. So these are the beginning features of number. Number is considered a synthesis of multiplicity. And what Bergson wants to unpack from this is a couple features of number, where number can be kind of considered in two ways. And when we consider it in the normal way, the primary way, we move towards quantification, towards discrete multiplicity. But in each of these sort of intuitions we have of number, there's the possibility of moving back towards our real duration, back towards the way it is experienced within consciousness and the way it is indivisibly connected to qualitative multiplicity. So at each of these junction points, we can divide in two directions. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. So first of all, number is a unit. It's a whole. It's a totality. It's a sum, right? And when we count things, we end up treating each thing that we count as identical. I have a sum of things that I'm counting, apples or dogs or horses or whatever, and each one that I see is one. It's a unit. And Bergson wants to point at the fact that there's two ways in which we can do this. We can say they're identical, and we can completely disregard the peculiarity of each of the things counted, or we can do it, as he says, similar to a shepherd. And a shepherd will count each of the sheep, but they know that each one is different. Each one has its peculiarities, things you need to watch out for. It has its personal history, and the shepherd doesn't completely forget those things in the process of counting. You know, the process of counting could become this anonymous thing where each one is just a unit and a completely indifferent unit, but it doesn't have to. And number kind of points at that fact that each of the things counted are in fact different realities with unique properties and nuances of difference. The other aspect of counting, and counting being this kind of primordial aspect of number, the other aspect is that counting has two dimensions to it as well. There is enumeration, which is an ongoing process. I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm not completed yet. There's no sum. There's no total. I'm at a provisional total at best. How far have you counted? I'm at 7, right? But I'm still going. And then there is sum, total, coming to a final totality. And that's the goal of counting, right? So the goal of counting is to take us into something completed, something static, something already finished. But the process of counting points us towards something in the making, something in a process, something not finished. And he likens this to the roll call. And a roll call is not simply enumerating, not simply counting, but this is a really great metaphor, because when you're doing a roll call, you're actually waiting on the people to call out their numbers and respond, right? So you're sitting there and somebody says 3, 4, 5. So in that sense, you're waiting on a reality outside of yourself. It's not about the mind standing before a multiplicity of discrete units laid out in space, as if, you were standing in front of a battalion in the army and you could just count everyone by looking at them. No, instead you're not on this privileged position. You can't see past the first row maybe, and you're hearing them call out to you, and you're waiting basically for reality to enumerate itself to you. And that's really the key here. In our experience of duration, this unfolding is a process in the making in which we cannot grasp it all at once. We cannot totalize it. We cannot bring it all into a simultaneous space in which we can discretely count every unit as, coexisting in juxtaposition. Later in the chapter, he attempts to define qualitative multiplicity in contradistinction to quantitative multiplicity, and he does so by examining what he calls pure duration. And in order to expound pure duration, he turns to the experience of a melody. And in a melody, the notes interpenetrate and form an organic whole. And these ideas of interpenetration and organic whole, he makes explicit by the idea of lengthening and shortening notes. If we play a melody and then we lengthen one of the notes, it's a different melody. It has a different quality to it overall. We don't notice the difference as a quantitative difference. We don't just say there's a larger quantity of that note. No, we notice the feeling difference that has. And we can switch back and forth between those perspectives. He's not saying that. But what he's saying is that the experience of the musical phrase as a kind of qualitative unity is something that forms by the notes interpenetrating, melting into each other, and sort of interweaving with one another. The first notes of the melody influence the later ones, and they shape them. We hear in those later notes aspects of the earlier notes that kind of contextualize them and make sense of them. And this is basic to the idea of a key. You hear a couple of notes, and then the notes that follow after are heard as playing in conjunction and forming a totality and a whole with those other notes. And they shape each other, and they give each other the quality that they have. If we change the order or the pattern at all, we get a new feeling. It gets a new qualitative totality, right? And the relation between multiplicity and unity here is super important. The parts interpenetrate, which means they form an indivisible whole. And if we cut or shorten or anything like that, what we're doing is not changing the quantity of the thing, we're changing its quality. Each moment that is added while we're listening to the melody go on changes our apperception of the prior moments, and that each note that is added is not a kind of quantitative addition to a sum that we have in our minds, but is altering the previous notes and is altered by the previous notes, such that when a melody is moving along, especially like in Baroque music or something, it's coming to a resolution or a climax or something like that, and instead of going where you expect it to go, it moves on to the next part and it evolves into another development. And the new note is not just an addition, like a mathematical addition, but is a transformation of this kind of expressive continuity, unfolding from one moment into the next, and where it melts into the next moment, but also is differentiated from that moment. So we have this really complex interplay between unity and multiplicity that is simply inexpressible in terms of number and discrete multiplicity. Bergson's basic idea here is that all the ability we have to quantify our experiences and to quantify the external world, that originates from a qualitative multiplicity of interpenetrating and continuously evolving and melting and interpenetrating moments in our duration. And it is thanks to that qualitative experience of time and duration that quantity comes about in the first place. And Bergson ends the chapter by trying to lay out some of the implications of this, and in particular with the way in which we understand ourself, our identity, our selfhood, personhood. And basically, when we quantify, when we symbolize, when we try to communicate things, we convert them into something public, into something common, into something general. So what we do is we take our inner life, which is made up of an infinity of nuances, of individual experiences, which are not repeatable within our life and are not repeatable from us to another person, right? We have all of these unique moments of our experience in time, which are molding into each other, melting into each other and interpenetrating, and have this indivisible durational quality. And we're stepping outside of them, cutting them up, quantifying them, or turning them into symbols, translating them into something general. And what we get from this is two selves. We get this kind of superficial communicated self, which is translated into symbols, and we get what he calls the deep or concrete self, and in later works he'll call the integral self, which is this indescribably complex, infinitely complex, and infinitely nuanced and detailed complexity of all of our memories, everything that we ever were, everything we ever wanted to be and never became, everything that we did and did become, right? It's this complex whole of contradictory parts, things, paths in life that we didn't go down but wanted to go down, or anything in the immense complexity of our life. And again, those nuanced differences between an emotion we felt as a kid and an emotion we feel now, a sort of pain or a pleasure, anything, they're all shaded and nuanced based on the place that they have within our life. And that is the self that we have a hard time describing. The self, the integral self, the concrete self, the deep self. And then there's this kind of impersonal self, which is the self that we create through quantification, through conceptualization, and through communication. And it's this impersonal, shallow, superficial self, the public self, which we use to understand freedom and which ultimately makes freedom impossible. And it's based on the concrete self, this durational self with its qualitative multiplicity and its concrete, infinitely complex and nuanced integral whole. We'll talk more about this within the class meeting, but that's the way this analysis of qualitative multiplicity and discrete multiplicity is then unpacked into a whole metaphysics and ontology.